Okay, if you remember from last time, Wilbur Whately went to Miskatonic University to grab the Necromonicon and was turned away. Okay. So, just the wrong one. There we go. So, let's begin. Chapter 6. The Dunwich horror itself came between Lamas and the Equinox in Lamas and the Equinox in 1928, and Dr. Armitage was among those who witnessed its monstrous prologue. He had heard, meanwhile, of Whately's grotesque trip to Cambridge, and of his frantic efforts to borrow or copy from Necromonicon at the Widener Library. I don't know why I have my earphones on. I'm not going to hear anything. Those efforts had been in vain, since Armitage had issued warnings of the keenest intensity to all librarians having charge of the dreaded volume. Wilbur had been shockingly nervous at Cambridge, anxious for the book, yet almost equally anxious to get home again, as if he feared the results of being away too long. Early in August, the half-expected outcome developed. In the small hours of the 3rd, Dr. Armitage was awakened suddenly by the wild, fierce cries of the savage watchdog on the college campus. Deep and terrible, the snarling, half-mad growls and barks continued, always in mounting volume, but with hideously significant pauses. Then there rang out a scream from a wholly different throat, such a scream as roused half the sleepers of Arkham and haunted their dreams ever afterward. Such a scream as could come from no being born of earth, or wholly of earth. Armitage, hastening into some clothing and rushing across the street and on to the college buildings, saw that others were ahead of him, and heard the echoes of a burglar alarm still shrilling from the library. An open window shewed black and gaping in the moonlight. What had come had indeed completed its entrance, for the barking and screaming, now fast fading into a mixed growling and moaning, proceeded unmistakably from within. Some instinct warned Armitage that what was taking place was not a thing for unfortified eyes to see, so he brushed back the crowd with authority as he unlocked the vestibule door. I should probably raise my mic a little bit so I don't keep hitting it with the pages. Among the others, he saw Professor Warren Rice and Dr. Francis Morgan, men to whom he had told of some of his conjectures and misgivings, and these two he motioned to accompany him inside. The inward sounds, except for the watchful droning whine from the dog, had by this time quite subsided. But Armitage now perceived with a sudden start that a loud chorus of whippoorwills among the shrubbery had commenced a damnably rhythmical piping, as if in unison with the last breaths of a dying man. The building was full of a frightful stench, which Dr. Armitage knew too well, and the 3 men rushed across the hall to the small genealogical reading room, whence the low whining came. For a second, nobody dared to turn on the light. Then Armitage summoned up his courage and snapped the switch. One of the 3, it is not certain which, shrieked aloud at what sprawled before them among disordered tables and overturned chairs. Professor Rice declares that he wholly lost consciousness for an instant, though he did not stumble or fall. The thing that lay half-bent on its side in a foetid pool of greenish-yellow ichor and tarry stickiness was almost 9 feet tall, and the dog had torn off all the clothing and some of its skin. It was not quite dead, but twitched silently and that word, while its chest heaved in monstrous unison with the mad piping of expedient whippoorwills outside. Bits of shoe leather and fragments of apparel were scattered about the room, and just inside the window, an empty canvas sack lay where it had evidently been thrown. Near the central desk, a revolver had fallen, a dented but undischarged cartridge later explaining why it had not been fired. The thing itself, however, crowded out all other images at the time. It would be trite and not wholly accurate to say that no human pen could describe it, but one may properly say that it could not be vividly visualized by anyone whose idea of aspect and contour are too closely bound up with the common life forms of this planet and of the three known dimensions. It was partly human, beyond a doubt, with very man-like hands and head, and the goatish, chinless face had the stamp of the Whateleys upon it. But the torso and lower parts of the body were teratologically fabulous, so that only generous clothing could ever have enabled it to walk on Earth unchallenged or uneradicated. Above the waist, it was semi-anthropomorphic, though its chest, where the dog's spreading paws still rested watchfully, had the leathery, reticulated hide of a crocodile or alligator. The back was piebald with yellow and black. It dimly suggested a squamous covering with certain snakes. Below the waist, though, it was for the worst. For here all human resemblance left off in sheer fantasy began. The skin was thickly covered with the coarse black fur, and from the abdomen a score of long greenish-gray tentacles with red sucking mouths protruded limply. The arrangement was odd, and seemed to follow the symmetries of some cosmic geometry unknown to Earth or the solar system. On each of the hips, deep set in a kind of pinkish ciliated orbit, was what seemed to be a rudimentary eye, whilst in lieu of a tail there depended a kind of trunk or feeler with purple annular markings, and with many evidences of being undeveloped mouth or throat. The limbs, save for the black fur, roughly resembled the hind legs of prehistoric Earth's giant saurians, and terminated in ridgy, veined pads, there with neither hooves nor claws. When the thing breathed, its tail and tentacles rhythmically changed color, as if from some circulatory cause normal to the non-human side of its ancestry. In the tentacles, this was observable as a deepening of the greenish tinge, whilst in the tail it was manifest as a yellowish appearance which alternated with a sickly grayish-white in the spaces between the purple rings. Of genuine blood, there was none. Only the fotid, greenish-yellow ichor which trickled along the painted floor beyond the radius of the stickiness, and of the curious discoloration behind it. As the presence of three men seemed to rouse the dying thing, it began to mumble without turning or raising its head. Dr. Armitage made no written record of its mouthings, but asserts confidently that nothing in English was uttered. At first the syllables defied all correlation with any speech of Earth, but toward the last there came some disjointed fragments evidently taken from the Necronomicon, that monstrous blaspheming quest of which that thing had perished. These fragments, as Armitage recalls them, ran something like Ngai, Naga, Uksrogo, Ya, Yog-Sothoth. Yog-Sothoth. They trailed off into nothingness as the whippoorwills shrieked in rhythmical crescendos of unholy anticipation. Then came a halt in the gasping, and the dog raised its head in a long, lugubrious howl. A change came over the yellow, goatish face of the prostrate thing, and the great black eyes fell lit appallingly. Outside the window, the shrilling of the whippoorwills had suddenly ceased, and above the murmurs of the gathering crowd, there came the sound of a panic-struck whirring and fluttering. Against the moon, vast clouds of feathery watchers rose and raced from sight, frantic at that which they sought for prey. All at once, the dog started up abruptly, gave a frightened bark, and leaped nervously out of the window by which it had entered. A cry rose from the crowd, and Dr. Armitage shouted to the men outside that no one must be admitted till the police or medical examiner came. He was thankful that the windows were just too high to permit a peering in, and drew the dark curtains carefully down over each one. By this time, 2 policemen had arrived, and Dr. Morgan, meeting them in the vestibule, was urging them for their own sakes to postpone entrance to the stench-filled reading room till the examiner came, and the prostrate thing could be covered up. Meanwhile, frightful changes were taking place on the floor. One need not describe the kind and rate of shrinkage and disintegration that occurred before the eyes of Dr. Armitage and Professor Rice. But it is permissible to say that, aside from the external appearance of face and hands, the really human element in Wilbur Whately must have been very small. When the medical examiner came, there was only a sticky whitish mass on the painted boards, and the monstrous odor had nearly disappeared. Apparently, Whately had no skull or bony skeleton, at least in any true or stable sense. He had taken somewhat after his unknown father. Chapter 7. Yet all this was only the prologue of the actual Dunwich horror. Formalities were gone through by bewildered officials, abnormal details were duly kept from the press and public, and men were sent to Dunwich and Aylesbury to look up property, notify any who might be heirs of the late Wilbur Whately. They found the countryside in great agitation, both because of the growing rumblings beneath the domed hills, because of the unwanted stench, and the surging, lapping sounds which came increasingly from the great empty shell formed by Whately's boarded-up farmhouse. Earl Sawyer, who tended the horse and cattle during Wilbur's absence, had developed a woeful, acute case of nerves. The officials devised excuses not to enter the noisome boarded place, and were glad to confine their survey of the deceased's living quarters, the newly mended sheds, to a single visit. They filed a ponderous report at the courthouse in Aylesbury, and litigations concerning heirship are said to be still in progress amongst the innumerably Whateleys, decayed and undecayed, of the upper Miskatonic Valley. An almost interminable manuscript in strange characters, written in a huge ledger, and judged a sort of diary because of the spacing and variations in ink and penmanship, presented a baffling puzzle to those who had found it on the old bureau, which served at its owner's desk. After a week of debate, it was sent to Miskatonic University, together with the deceased's collection of strange books, for study and possible translation. But even the best linguists soon saw that it was not likely to be unreadable with ease. No trace of the ancient gold with which Wilbur and old Whateleys always paid their debts had yet been discovered. It was in the dark of September 9th that the horror broke loose. The hill noises had been pronounced during the evening, and the dogs barked frantically all night. Early risers on the 10th noticed a peculiar stench in the air. About 7 o'clock, Luther Brown, the hired boy at George Corey's between Cold Spring Glen and the village, rushed presently back from his morning trip to the 10-acre meadow with the cows. He was almost convulsed with fright as he stumbled into the kitchen. In the yard outside, with no less frightened herd, were pawing and lowing pitifully, having followed the boy back in the panic they shared with him. Between gasps, Luther tried to stammer out his tale to Mrs. Corey. Sorry, forgot to mute myself. Up there in the road beyond the glint, Miss Corey. Wait, that's wrong accent. There's something been there. It smells like thunder and let's go with it. It smells like thunder and all the bushes and little trees is pushed back from the run, like their house have been moved out along with it. And they ain't worse than other. Why are they... Wait, where does this take place again? I don't remember. Sorry, what was I? They prints in the road, Miss Corey. Great round prints as big as a barrel heads, all sunk down deep like elephant had been along. Only there's a sight more no feet could make. I looked at one or two before I run in, and I see every one is covered with lines spreading out from one place, like as a big palm leaf fans, 3 times as big as their eyes. It'd have been pounded down in the mud, and the smell was awful like what is around Wizard Whately's old house. Oh. Here he faltered, and seemed to shiver afresh with the fright that had sent him flying home. I'm sorry if that previous paragraph made no sense. Mrs. Corey, unable to extract more information, began telephoning the neighbors, thus starting on its round the overture of panic that heralded the major terrors. When she got Sally Sawyer, housekeeper at Seth Bishop's, the nearest place to Whately's, it became her turn to listen instead of transmit. For Sally's boys, Chauncey, who slept poorly, had been on the hill toward Whately's, and had dashed back in terror after one look at the place, and at the pasturage where Mr. Bishop's cows had been left out all night. Give me a second, sorry. I think this is a female's voice. Yes, Miss Corey, came Sally's tremulous voice over the party wire. Chauncey, he can just come back or posting, and couldn't have talked for the what? He says old Whately's house is all blown up, with the timbers scattered around like them been dynamite outside. Only the bottom floor ain't through, but it's all covered with kind of a tar-like stuff that smells often like drips down, often ages onto the ground. Water, seed timbers is all blown away. And they off kingdom marks in the yard, to great round marks, bigger round old hog's head, and all sticky white stuff is like it's on the blown up house. Chauncey says he lays off into the meadows, where a great swath wire in a barn is marred down, and all the sun walls tumbled every which way wherever it goes. Does it keep going? I can't tell if it keeps going. Yeah. And he says he, Miss Score, as how he ought sought to look for Seth's cows, finding as he was,
and found him in the upper pasture tonight, the devil's hop yard in the awful shape. Half found him clean gone, and half right him off. That has left his suck most dry of blood, with sores on him like they've been on Whately's cattle ever since Lavinia's black brat was born. Except he's gone now, and look at him. Though I vow he won't gonna get, oh my gosh. He won't care to very, sorry. Chauncey didn't look careful till he see while the big old matted down swath laid after it left the pasturage, but he says he thinks it pinned towards Glen run of the village. I tell you, Miss Corey, there's something broad something abroad as hadn't or to be abroad, as I for one think that Black Wilbur Whately has come to the bad end he deserved, as at the bottom of the bringing of it. He wasn't all himself. Say that again. He wasn't all human himself, I say to everybody, and I think he old Whately's must have raised something in their nailed up house, as ain't even so human as he was. They always been unseen things around Dunwich. There were things as ain't human as they ain't good for human folks. The ground was all talking last night, and towards morning, Chauncey he heard whippoorwills so loud in Cold Spring Glen he couldn't sleep none. Then he thought he heard another faint-like sound towards Wizard Whately's, a kind of ripping or tearing of wood, like some big box of grape was whipping open fur off. What with this and that, he didn't get to sleep till the sun up, and so neither was he up this morning, until he got over to Whately's and seen what the matter. He's seen enough, I tell you, Miss Corey. This don't mean no good, and I think all's about the men folks ought to get apart and do something. I know something awful's about, and I feel my time is nigh, that only God knows just what it is. Did you take account of what them big tracks led to? No? Well, Miss Corey, if they ever on the Glen run this side of the Glen, ain't got to your house yet, I calculate they must go into the Glen itself. They would do that. I always say Cold Spring Glen ain't no healthy, no decent place. The whippoorwills and fireflies never did act like they weren't great as a god, and they the same as you can hear strange things a rushing and talking in the air down there if you stand in the right place, between the rocks falling bear's den.
By that noon, fully 3/4 of the men and the boys of Dunwich were trooping over the roads and meadows between new-made Whately's, roots in Cold Spring Glen, examining in horror the vast, monstrous prints, the maimed bishop cattle, the strange noisome wreck of the farmhouse, and the bruised vegetation of the fields and roadsides. Whatever had burst loose upon the world had assuredly gone down to the great sinister ravine, for all the trees on the banks were bent and broken, and a great avenue had been gouged in the hanging underbrush. It was as though a house launched by an avalanche had slid down through the tangled growths of the almost vertical slope. From below no sound came, but only a distant, undefinable falter. It is not to be wondered at that the men prefer to stay on the edge and argue, rather than descend and beard the unknown cyclopean horror in its lair. 3 dogs that were with the party had barked furiously at first, but seemed cowed and reluctant when near the glen. Someone telephoned the news to the Aylesbury Transcript, but the editor, accustomed to the wild tales from Dunwich, did no more than concoct a humorous paragraph about it, an item soon afterward reproduced by the Associated Press. That night, everyone went home, and every house and barn was barricaded as stoutly as possible. Needless to say, no cattle were allowed to remain in open pasturage. About 2 in the morning, a frightful stench and a savage barking of the dogs awakened the household at Elmer Friars, on the eastern edge of Cold Spring Glen, and all agreed that they could hear a sort of muffled swishing or lapping from somewhere outside. Mrs. Fire proposed telephoning the neighbors, and Elmer was about to agree when the noise splintering wood burst in upon their deliberations. It came, apparently, from the barn, and was quickly followed by hideous screaming and stamping amongst the cattle. The dogs slavered and crouched close to the feet of the fear-numbled family. Fire lit a lantern through force of habit, but knew it would be deaf to go out into the black farm yard. The children and the womenfolk whimpered, kept from screaming by some obscure vestigial extinct of defense which told them that their lives depended on silence. At last the noise of the cattle subsided to a pitiful moaning, and a great snapping, crashing, and crackling ensued. The friars huddled together in the sitting room, did not dare to move until the last echoes died away from far down in Cold Spring Glen. Then amidst the dismal moans from the stable, and the daemonic piping of the late whippoorwills in the glen, Selina Fryer tottered to the telephone and spread what news she could of the second phase of the horror. The next day, all the countryside was in a panic, and cowed, uncommunicative groups came and went where the fiendish thing had occurred. 2 titan paths of destruction stretched from the glen to the friar farmland. Monstrous prints covered the bare patches of the ground, and one side of the old red barn had completely caved in. Of the cattle, only a quarter could be found and identified. Some of these were in curious fragments, and all that survived had to be shot. Earl Sawyer suggested that help be asked from Aylesbury or Arkham, but others maintained it would be of no use. Old Zebulon Whately, of a branch that hovered about halfway between soundness and decadence, made darkly wild suggestions about rites that ought to be practiced on the hilltops. He came of a line where tradition ran strong, and his memories of chantings in the great stone circles were not altogether connected with Wilbur and his grandfather. Darkness fell upon a stricken countryside too passive to organize for a real defense. In a few cases, closely related families would band together and watch in gloom under one roof. But in general, there was only a repetition of the barricading of the night before, and a futile and effective gestures of loading muskets and setting pitchforks handily about. Nothing, however, occurred except some hill noises, and when the day came, there were many who hoped that the new horror had gone swiftly, as it had come. There were even bold souls who proposed an offensive expedition down the glen, though they did not venture to set an actual example to still reluctant majority. When night came, again the barricading was repeated, but there was a less huddling together of families. In the morning, both the friar and the Seth Bishop households reported excitement among the dogs and vague sounds and stenches from afar, while early explorers noted with horror a fresh set of the monstrous tracks in the road skirting Sentinel Hill. As before, the sides of the road strewed of bruising indicative of the blasphemously stupendous bulk of the horror, whilst the conformation of the tracks seemed to argue passage in 2 directions, as if the moving mountain had come from Cold Spring Glen and returned to it along the same path. At the base of the hill, a 30-foot swath of crushed shrubbery, saplings led steeply upward, and the seekers gasped when they saw that even most perpendicular places did not deflect the inexorable trail. Whatever the horror was, it could scale a sheer stony cliff of almost complete verticality, and as the investigators climbed around to the hill summit by safer routes, they saw that the trail ended, or rather, reversed there. And get more water. It was here that the Whateleys used to build their hellish fires and chant their hellish rituals by the table like stone on May Eve in Hallowmass. Now that very stone formed the center of a vast space thrashed around by the mountainous horror, whilst upon its slightly concave surface was a thick and folded deposit of the same tarry stickiness observed on the floor of the ruined Whateley farmhouse when the horror escaped. Men looked at one another and muttered. Then they looked down the hill. Apparently the horror had descended by a route much the same as that of its ascent. To speculate was futile. Reason, logic, and normal ideas of motivation stood confounded. Only old Zebulon, who was not with the group, could have done justice to the situation or suggested a plausible explanation. Thursday night began much like others, but it ended less happily. The whippoorwills in the glen had screamed with such unusual persistence that many could not sleep, and about 3 a.m., all the party telephones rang tremendously. Those who took down their receivers heard a fright-mad voice shriek out, and some thought a crashing sound followed the breaking of the exclamation. There was nothing more. No one dared to do anything, and no one knew till morning whence the call came. Then those who had heard it called everyone on the line, and found that only the friars did not reply. The truth appeared an hour later, when a hastily assembled group of armed men trudged out to the fireplace at the head of the glen. It was horrible, yet hardly a surprise. There were more swaths and monstrous prints, but there was no longer any house. It had caved in like an eggshell, and amongst the ruins nothing living or dead could be discovered. Only a stench and a tarry stickiness. The Aylmer friars had been erased from Dunwich. Chapter 8. In the meantime, a quieter yet even more spiritual poignant phase of the horror had been blackly unwinding itself behind the closed door of a shelf-lined room in Arkham. The curious manuscript record or diary of Wilbur Whaley, delivered to Miskatonic University for translation, had caused much worry and bafflement among the experts in languages both ancient and modern. Its very alphabet, notwithstanding a general resemblance to the heavily shaded Arabic used in Mesopotamia, being absolutely unknown to any available authority. The final conclusion of the linguist was that the text represented an artificial alphabet, giving the effect of a cipher, though none of the usual methods of cryptographic solutions seemed to furnish any clue, even when applied on the basis of every tongue the writer might conceivably have used. The ancient books taken from Whiteley's quarters, while absorbingly interesting and in several cases promising to open up new and terrible lines of research among philosophers and men of science, were of no assistance whatever in this matter. One of them, a heavy tome with an iron clasp, was in another unknown alphabet. This one of a very different cast, and resembling Sanskrit more than anything else. The old ledger was at length given wholly into the charge of Dr. Armitage, both because of his peculiar interest in the Whately matter, and because of his wide linguistic learning and skill in the mystical formulae in antiquity in the Middle Ages. Armitage had an idea the alphabet might be something historically used by certain forbidden cults, which have come down from old times, which have been inherited many forms and traditions from the wizards of the Saracenic world. That question, however, he did not deem vital, since it would be unnecessary to know the origin of the symbols, if, as he suspected, they were used as a cipher in a modern language. It was his belief that, concerning the great amount of text involved, the writer would scarcely have wished the trouble of using another speech than his own, save perhaps in certain special formula and incantations. Accordingly, he attacked the manuscript with the preliminary assumption that the bulk of it was English. Dr. Armitage knew, from the repeated failures of his colleagues, that the riddle was a deep and complex one, and that no simple mode of solution could merit even a trial. All through late August, he fortified himself with the massed lore of cryptography, drawing upon the fullest resource of his own library, and waiting night after night amidst the arcana of Trimethius Polygraphia, Giambattista Portas de Fortivis, Literium Notice, Falconer's Cryptomenisis Patafacta, Davies and Thickness, 18th century treaties, and such fairly modern authorities as Blair, von Martin, and Kluber. Cryptography. He interspersed his study of the books with attacks on the manuscript itself, and in time became convinced that he had to deal with one of those subtlest and most ingenious of cryptograms, in which many separate lists of corresponding letters are arranged like the multiplication table, and message built up with arbitrary keywords known only to the initiated. The older authorities seemed rather more helpful than the newer ones, and Armitage concluded that the code of the manuscript was one of great antiquity, no doubt handed down through a long line of mystical experimenters. Several times he seemed near daylight, only to be set back by some unforeseen obstacle. Then, as September approached, the clouds began to clear. Certain letters, as used in certain parts of the manuscript, emerged definitely and unmistakably, and it became obvious that the text was indeed in English. On the evening of September 2nd, the last major barrier gave way, and Dr. Armitage read for the first time a continuous passage of Wilbur Whately's Annals. It was in truth a diary, and all had thought, and it was couched in a style clearly shewing the mixed occult erudition and general illiteracy of the strange being who wrote it. Almost the first long passage that Armitage deciphered, an entry dated November 26, 1916, proved highly startling and disquieting. It was written, he remembered, by a child of 3.5, who had looked like a lad of 12 or 15. Today learned the Aklo for the Sabbath, it ran, which did not like it being answerable from the hill and not from the air. The upstairs more ahead of me than I had thought it would be. It is not like to have much earth brain. Shot Elam Hutchins, collie, Jack, when he went to bite me, and Elam says he would kill me if he had asked. I guess he won't. Grandfather kept me saying the dough formula last night, and I think I saw the inner city at the tomb magnetic poles. I shall go to those poles when the earth is cleared off. If I can't break through with the Dohan formula when I commit it. The heat from the air told me at Sabbath that it would be years before I can clear off the earth, and I can guess Grandfather would be dead then. So I shall have to learn all the angles of the planes and all the formulas between They from outside will help, but they cannot take body without human blood. The upstairs looks like it would be the right cast. I can see it a little when I make the Voorish sign, or blow the powder of the Ibn Ghassi at it. And it near like them had May Eve on the hill. The other face may wear off some. I wonder how I shall look when the earth is cleared, and there are no earth beings on it. He that came from the Aklo Salaf said I may be transfigured, there being much of outside to work on. Morning found Dr. Armitage in cold sweat of terror and a frenzy of wakeful concentration. He had not left the manuscript all night, but sat at his table under the electric lighting, turning page after page, with shaking hands as fast as he could decipher the cryptic text. He had nervously telephoned his wife he would not be home, and when she brought him a breakfast from the house, he could scarcely dispose of a mouthful. All that day he read on, now and then halted maddeningly, so reapplication of the complex key became necessary. Lunch and dinner were brought him, but he only ate the smallest fraction of either. Toward the middle of the next night, he drowsed off in his chair, but soon awake out of a tangle of nightmares, almost as hideous as the truth and menaces to men's existence that he had uncovered. On the morning of September 4th, Professor Rice and Dr. Morgan insisted on seeing him for a while, and departed trembling in ashen gray. That evening, he went to bed, but slept only a fistful. Wednesday, the next day, he was back at the manuscript and began to take copious notes from both the current sections and from those he had already deciphered. In the small hours that night, he slept a little in an easy chair in his office. He was at the manuscript again before dawn. Sometime before noon, his physician, Dr. Hartwell, called to see him and insisted that he cease work. He refused, intimating that he was of the most vital importance for him to complete the readings of the diary, and promising an explanation in due course of time. That evening, just as twilight fell, he finished his terrible perusal and sank back exhausted. His wife, bringing his dinner, found him in a half-comatose state, but he was constant enough to warn her off with a sharp-eyed cry when he saw her eyes wander toward the notes he had taken. Weakly rising, he gathered up the scribbled papers and sealed them in a great envelope, which he immediately placed in his inside coat pocket. He had sufficient strength to get home, but was so clearly in need of medical aid that Dr. Hartwell was summoned at once. As the doctor put him to bed, he could only mutter over and over again, "But what in God's name can we do?" Dr. Armitage slept, but was partly delirious the next day. He made no explanations to Hartwell, but in his calmer moments spoke of the imperative need for a long conference with Rice and Morgan. His wilder wanderings were very startling indeed, including frantic appeals that something in a boarded-up farmhouse be destroyed, and fantastic references to some plan for the extirpation of the entire human race, and all animal and vegetable life from the earth by some terrible elder of beings from another dimension. He would shout that the world was in danger, since the other things wished to strip it and drag it away from the solar system and causes of matter into some other plane of phase, the entity from which had once fallen vigintillions of eons ago. At other times he would call for the dreaded Necromonicon and De Monolatrea of Remigius, in which he seemed hopeful of finding some formula to check the peril he conjured up. "Stop them! Stop them!" he would shout. "Those Whateleys meant to let them in, and the worst of all is left. Tell Rice and Morgan we must do something. It's blind business, but I know how to make the powder. It hadn't been fed since the 2nd of August, when Wilbur came here to his death, and at that rate..." But Armitage had sound physique despite his 73 years, and slept off his disorder that night without developing a real fever. He woke late Friday, clear of head, though sober with a gnawing fear and tremendous sense of responsibility. Saturday afternoon he felt able to go over to the library and summon Rice and Morgan for a conference, and the rest of that day and even the three men tortured their brains in the wildest speculation and the most desperate debate. Strange and terrible books were drawn voluminously from the stacked shelves and from secure places of storage, and diagrams and formulae were copied with feverfully haste and bewildering abundance. Of skepticism there was none. All three had seen the body of Wilbur Whately as it lay on the floor in a room of that very building, and after that none of them could feel even slightly inclined to treat the diary as a madman's raving. Opinions were divided as to notifying the Massachusetts State Police, and the negative finally won. There were things involved which simply could not be believed by those who had not seen a sample, as the deed was made clear during certain subsequent investigations. Late at night, the conference disbanded without having developed a definite plan. But all day Sunday, Armitage was busy comparing formulae and mixing chemicals obtained from the college laboratory. The more he reflected on the hellish diary, the more he was inclined to doubt the deficiency of any material agent in stamping out that entity which Wilbur Whately had left behind him. the earth-threatening entity which, unknown to him, was to burst forth in a few hours and became the memorable Dunwich horror. Monday was a repetition of Sunday with Dr. Armitage, for the task in hand required an infinity of research and experiment. Further consultations of the monstrous diary brought about various exchanges of plans, and he knew that even in the end, a large amount of uncertainty must remain. By Tuesday, he had a definite line of action mapped out, and believed he would try a trip to Dunwich within a week. Then on Wednesday, the great shock came. Tucked obscurely away in a corner of the Arkham Advertiser was a fictitious little item from the Associated Press, telling what a record-breaking monster the bootleg whiskey of Dunwich had raised up. Armitage, half stunned, could only telephone for Rice and Morgan. Far into the night, they discussed the next day with a whirlwind of preparation on the part of them all. Armitage knew he would be meddling with terrible powers, yet saw that there was no other way to annul the deeper and more malign meddling which others had done before him. I'll take another drink of water, excuse me. Oh boy. Oh boy. Wait. Oh boy. It's kinda quite a bit. Thank you for the follow. Nova. I appreciate it. So we are at the last two chapters. We are at chapter 9. And if you could tell from watching me, you could see me yawn quite a bit. And it is quite late. And I know you're thinking, why stream so late then? I don't know. I think we should save the last two chapters because it is getting late and it is going to take a while. And I know Lulu would want me to sleep. Well, anyone would. But who knows? Maybe we'll continue this morning, or we play No Man's Sky. I think we could try for both. We'll see. So, thank you for joining me this stream. I appreciate your company, and I hope you enjoyed this reading. If you missed most of it, this will be on YouTube. I do not edit these, well, the readings, so expect it tomorrow. Yeah, so thank you again, and I'll see you later.